biennial budget was for Maine families like hers, hardworking people trying to stay healthy, stay in the workforce, and contribute to our economy, put food on the table. We didn't know at the time how critical those investments in public health and in the health of our economy might truly be. So while we were experiencing challenges like any other state, a year ago, Maine's economy was moving in the right direction. The number of jobs was on the rise, unemployment at a near all-time low, and average wages were increasing. Maine's economy was getting stronger, but a global pandemic would soon stand in the way of progress. We could foresee the negative economic impact of the pandemic on the state of Maine, but we did not know the full extent. We did not wait to find out. My administration responded with fiscal pragmatism, and we worked with the legislature to immediately stabilize the state budget and rein in state spending. Those fiscally responsible steps last spring, combined with federal coronavirus relief funds and better than anticipated state revenues this fall and winter, will allow us to fulfill our remaining commitments for this fiscal year and carry over remaining savings to cover the projected shortfall in the upcoming biennium. In light of that news, today I'm presenting a balanced supplemental budget and a balanced biannual budget to the Maine legislature. These budgets maintain the critical services the legislature and my administration had restored in the last biennium, and they bolster our response to the still raging pandemic while continuing to tighten our belts and maximize savings. These proposals do not change tax rates. They do not create new programs. They do include $3 million for the Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention for their health and environmental testing lab, for the health inspection program, the Maine immunization program, and the public health emergency preparedness program. $5 million for Maine CDC for COVID-19 testing and vaccine distribution and services for people who must stay in isolation and in quarantine. $6 million for Section 29 services for adults with developmental disabilities. $45 million for Maine care rate increases for nursing facilities, residential facilities for children and older Mainers, and services for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, our most vulnerable citizens. $7.5 million for community mental health and an intensive response to the epidemic of substance use disorder, which because of this pandemic has only grown worse. $45 million, additional funds for general purpose aid to K through 12 public education, and $1.8 million for broadband. The combined budgets, supplemental and biennial budgets, add about $61 million to the Budget Stabilization Fund, otherwise known as the Rainy Day Fund, over the 3 fiscal years involved, to help the state weather the pandemic and as a hedge against future fiscal crises. If approved, these budgets together would increase the Budget Stabilization Fund to more than $320 million, a record amount of savings. In all, my budget proposal for fiscal years 2022-2023 would result in an increase of less than 0.75% over commitments in the baseline budget. In other words, it largely holds spending flat. Some of the challenges we face today are greater than ever before. Just today it was reported that 41 more people have died with COVID-19, and another 782 people contracted the virus. While the arrival of COVID-19 vaccine in Maine brings us hope, it will be many, many months before all eligible people in our state are vaccinated, while public health precautions keep people as safe as possible from the virus. For almost a year now, teachers and school personnel have educated our children in hybrid, remote, and in-person classrooms while protecting their health and safety. Healthcare clinicians have worked around the clock to test and treat Maine people for a new and deadly disease. Long-term care providers and direct care workers have risked their own health to take care of older Mainers and those with disabilities. Children have learned and parents have worked remotely, logging on to keep themselves and others safe. And families have struggled to survive job losses and loss of income caused by a pandemic that was no fault of their own. These budgets here are for them. State government cannot be all things to all people all the time, nor can it solve all problems or address all needs of all people of the state. But during emergencies such as this pandemic, the people need to depend on us to protect their children, to secure health care, to safeguard educational and vocational opportunity, and protect our most vulnerable citizens. I take seriously my obligation to be a responsible steward of taxpayer dollars. I'm also, however, not going to walk away from or abandon Maine families in their time of need. These budgets are a blueprint for common sense, compassion, and community during our time of greatest need. They hold on to the vision of Maine as the safest, healthiest, and most beautiful state in the nation. May it be so. Thank you, and I'm happy to begin taking questions, I believe starting with Dawn Kerrigan.
Hi, Governor.
Hi,
thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry, it took a minute to unmute. Obviously, you're shifting money from some other places to make all of this happen, if there's no new revenue other than federal. Where are you taking funds away from or shifting from in order to make these increases and make up for the expected reduction in tax revenue?
Good question. Thank you, Dawn. Well, let's just go back, because it is pretty complicated. There's no simple chart here saying take here, give there. But go back to the summer when the Revenue Forecasting Committee met following the Economic Forecasting Commission, and they projected a huge downturn in resources, a downturn in revenues. We responded primarily in September with a 12-page financial order and curtailment order that included about 270 specific actions, detailed actions, where we saved money in all the various departments and set aside savings, hedging against that huge downturn that was projected in July. Then the Revenue Forecasting Committee and Economic Forecasting Commission met again in December, and those projections came up a bit, fairly substantially actually. So we were able to book those savings and carry them forward into the rest of this fiscal year, and now carry them forward into the biennium. Commissioner Figueroa, do you have anything to add to that, or care to explain it in a better way than I just did?
Well, Governor, I would never say better. Just to condense, I think, and restate, as the Governor indicated, we did a lot of hard work during that curtailment effort, and the same sources that we talked to then are the same sources that we've been talking to about for 10 months, and the same sources that we use now. As a reminder, there was an unexpended general fund balance at the end of March when we closed the biennial budget and reached that agreement with the legislature there. And then we also identified nearly $222 million worth of curtailments, as well as the other resources in the curtailment order of the $70 million at the Maine Municipal Bond Bank as a result of unobligated alcoholic beverages revenues not needed for debt service, and unencumbered balances that were available throughout the state.
May I follow up?
Go ahead, please.
Yes. So is it basically $222 million in curtailments from last year basically continue across state government, and that accounts for most of the savings to do what you're doing? Is that correct?
Actually, I'd like to say that it's a blend. So we, again, in October, had to do that curtailment effort. But then when we were continuing the work that we've been doing for the last several months on the biennial budget, each line item in all agencies' budget was scrubbed by those department heads, commissioners, etc. And where we could continue those reductions, they did. Where they couldn't, they made alternate suggestions, and that basically line by line. So some of it will continue, some of it will be different. A significant component of the curtailment, as you might recall, was using corona relief funds to pay for certain payroll for public safety, public health and safety personnel. That can't continue because those funds were not appropriated by the federal government in this last round. But we made different efficiencies. We continue in this budget, as we always do, but in particular this year, the Department of Health and Human Services continues to maximize federal opportunities because of enhanced matching rates. And then other departments across the state also maximize to our availability any other non-general fund resources, and as well as continuing those administrative efficiencies where we can, holding our ship steady in the storm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. David Sharp?
Hi, Governor. Your statement says that the budget doesn't change tax rates. Is that the same thing as saying there will be no new taxes and no new tax increases?
Essentially, yes. There's no drama to this budget. We're not increasing the income tax, or as some have suggested we should. We're not expanding. We're holding the line on the property tax relief measures, for instance, that were enacted last March and in the previous biennium, with strong consensus of the legislature. Things like that we're not changing. Correct.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you, David. Phil Hirschhorn. Hirschhorn, sorry. You're on mute, Phil.
Sorry, you think we'd have zoomed down by now after all these months. I want to follow up Don's question, then ask one other. Just to be clear, when we talk about curtailment, I can't remember, was there a sort of a fixed percentage across the board budget cut, even though you're maintaining, generally speaking, all the vital services? When I look at the math, I believe your summary documents say there was around a $255 million predicted budget gap at the end of December, and then you talk about a $61 million addition to the rainy day fund. So that sounds to me like the $300 million less in spending than the revenue forecast. I just want to make sure I'm doing the math that matches what you're telling us. And my second question is, what happened to the other $1.55 billion in federal coronavirus aid funds? We know about the $1.25 billion that was spent in 2020, but the report talks about a total of $2.8 billion that went to state government. And I'm not sure how that's accounted for, unless, again, I'm misunderstanding your report documents. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Figueroa, would you like to commence a response? I
will. So let me start with the second one, if you don't mind. So we're talking about when we talk about the CARES Act funding and the available funding from the federal government, we refer right now to an amount roughly $7.6 billion. I want to say that does not include the funding that recently was enacted by the federal government. We're still working out those numbers and we'll update. I also want to point out that on the Bureau of Budget website, there is an entire page dedicated to talking about that $7.6 billion. And what we mean by approximately 4.5 went direct. So let me just talk about that for a second. We're talking about items like the PPP program and the EDIL loans that were available directly through financial aid institutions, or provider funds that were sent directly to hospitals, or higher education dollars that were sent directly to the universities. And then the 2.8 that we talk about are funds that flowed through the state, through state government, mostly the 1.25 of Corona relief funds that we've talked about that the governor thoughtfully committed. All of those details are out in a spreadsheet, and they touched a number of entities, including schools and municipalities for public health programs, and an unemployment insurance trust deposit, municipal grant programs to small businesses, healthcare professional businesses, as well as agriculture. And then the other significant part of that 2.8 was the pandemic relief monies from the federal government. So the PUA program, the extra $600, the extended benefits. So those are primarily the two largest sources. Those add up to more than the 2 point.
So the 1.55 he was asking about were mostly direct payments that flowed through the state over which we had no discretion.
Yeah, and I'll just add two examples from the Department of Health and Human Services. We got about $11 million for child care. It came through our block grants, and we turned around and gave that to our child care providers. We also experienced in Medicaid or main care an increase in the federal share of payments of 6.2%, which decreased the amount of general fund needed for that program. Those are two examples of non-congressional coronavirus relief funds that came to the state but were passed through to different parts of the economy.
So it sounds like you're saying there's no leftover at the moment federal coronavirus aid funds. Did I do the math right on the $300 million? That it's the $300 million in revenue that's forecast that you're not spending that accounts for the balanced budget, given the $255 million projected shortfall and the $61 million for the rainy day fund? Did I do the math right there?
I'm gonna just jump in and delicately say no. But why don't I just reset for a minute? Because to the governor's initial point, we have watched a significant amount of change over the past 10 months, and I think she highlights that change likely isn't over because the pandemic isn't over. But I'm just going to level set on the numbers, and then maybe you ask your question in a different way. As what we were particularly talking about and what the governor mentioned was that in the April, May, June reforecast, we were reforecasted to have a shortfall of anticipated revenues over the 3 years of approximately $1.4 million. And now that shortfall is more closer to $630 million over the 3 years. And as what we talk about is that the efforts that we made by dealing with the then nearly $528 million 1 year problem have helped us resolve what is now essentially the same math over 3 years. And we do that through a number of initiatives, which are utilizing some resources from unencumbered balances or the Maine Municipal Bond Bank. We do that by going through with the curtailment effort that we already worked through in October, and then carrying through some of those reductions into 22 and 23. And then again, we do that through maximizing other federal resources and some administrative efficiencies. Again, drawing on where one department might go up, another department might go down across state government, trying to keep that baseline budget flat for 22 and 23.
Is there a fixed percentage across the board on the curtailment, and is anybody getting an increase? All those things you mentioned, Maine Care, the CDC funding, the public school funding, do any of those line items represent increases, and did the curtailment have a fixed percentage cut to get to your balance? And I will not ask any more questions. Thank you.
Well, we originally asked departments to try to budget for 10% increases across the board. They came back, every department, including the judicial branch, came back with potential savings. And a lot of that we carried through, but it wasn't 10%. It did not end up being 10% across the board. And what I reported to you a few minutes ago in my opening remarks, those remarks do include any increases, including, for instance, Section 21, Section 29, waiver increases to those programs for some of our most needy citizens, our most vulnerable people, and the increase to general purpose aid to education in that trajectory, that slow but sure trajectory towards 55% state share of education costs.
Yeah. I'd like to highlight that as you're working through the budget, as the budget will be worked through, in almost every department, there are reductions and then reset priorities and some increases. So yes, to what the governor just stated, we have increased our GPA number by some $45 million over the biennial, increasing that percentage to 51.83. We add more than $45 million to rate increases to providers in the Department of Health and Human Services. We continue programs established by the legislature, such as the homestead exemption, and add $15 million to that program to fund the changes that were made in the last session. We fund the renewable energy credits through Public Law 2019, Chapter 440 in this budget. And so we make, as the governor initially stated, we make significant continued investments in the priorities that she has set for the state since taking office, and are able to do that through the resources that we've been talking about and thinking about for the last 10 months, as well as the continued efforts of maximizing other resources that we have available.
Yeah, in the legislative priorities already included, there are built-in increases in the base from, for instance, rebasing nursing home rates and things of that sort, which are incorporated in this budget. So next, who's next? Who's next on the list? Oh, here it is. Allegra Zamori, WABI. Allegra.
Hi there. I was just wondering, I know you touched on it briefly in your opening statement, if you could just speak more to the importance of allotting all that funding to education, especially after what we've seen from the pandemic over the last few months.
Well, it's been a high priority of the people of Maine since 2003 or 4, when the referendum was passed, requiring the state to come as close as possible to 55% of state share of K through 12 general purpose aid to education. So we're following on that track. We're not there yet. We're not at 55, and as more and more money is spent on education, the denominator becomes higher and the numerator becomes higher as a result as well. But we're getting there. And I think those are needs established by the people of Maine and by the legislature time after time after time. In this particular last year, educators and school staff, from bus drivers and janitors to superintendents and administrators, all up and down the line, have really pivoted in creative ways to try to keep our students on track. It's been extraordinarily difficult. I think it's one thing I worry about almost more than anything else, is the learnings gap that our kids may encounter by not being personally in school to get that face-to-face education that we think is the most effective way to learn. So they have encountered a lot of hurdles this past year, and they've responded as well as they possibly can. And this budget continues on that path to help the state fulfill its share of the educational funds. And Fred Bever. Fred.
Hi, I'm going to defer to Mal.
Oh, Mal's here.
I think so.
Member of the staff of Maine Public. Hey, Mal.
Governor, how are you?
Good, thank you.
You served on the Appropriations Committee, and you know full well that every governor has to submit change packages. Isn't it likely, given what's going on in Washington, not knowing how much additional aid will come from there, and the course of the pandemic, that your change package may be very significant when you start issuing it? is this really sort of a placeholder budget to get the process started, knowing full well there's going to be these major changes out of the Biden administration?
Well, good question, and I'm glad you envision major changes. I can't foretell the future. I'm not a prognosticator, but Kirsten and her staff and Commissioner Figueroa and Commissioner Lambrew and her staff, Commissioner Macon and her staff have worked day and night in the last few weeks to achieve and present a real budget, as real numbers, real proposals for this legislature to deliberate. They are under pressure in the next few months to make any changes that they see fit on a bipartisan basis and come up with a balanced budget to be passed on an emergency basis with 2/3 votes of both houses. I don't want to in any respect diminish this budget because it is not a placeholder. It's a real budget. And it has to assume that nothing else occurs. It has to, because that's the way budgets are done. We have to be realistic based on today's figures, today's revenues, today's necessary expenditures. What the federal government does in the coming months, I can't predict, and how much, to what extent the Congress of the United States comes forward and provides additional funding for certain purposes, that would be most welcome. And if that happens, there may be a change package or two, but I can't predict that. I'm not going to count on that. We're going to count on the good common sense that goes into this budget and the accounting that has developed these figures we're presenting today.
I listened very carefully to both the Economic Forecasting Group and the Revenue Forecasting Group, and they were making assumptions that the budget figures they gave you and the revenue figures were just a guess, a best guess, but still a guess, given the pandemic. If the pandemic worsens, they were saying the revenues will go down. If the situation improves, revenues will even be better. And that's why I said it sounds like a placeholder, because until we know what's going to happen, you may in the biennial budget have more money to spend or less money to spend.
Is that a statement? I like that. That's a question. It's a good observation, Mal, and you, better than anybody in the state of Maine, have paid attention to these forecasts and know what they are. They are the best we can do, the best information that we have. I don't think they use the word guess. I think they use the word projections and estimates. And they are fairly realistic. They are experts in these areas, in the areas of the economics of Maine and revenue forecasts. Obviously, for instance, when the casinos were closed, less casino revenue fell into that cascade that comes from their revenues. As a small example of how things have changed, to the extent that the economy recovers in the next few months, it becomes more robust, and you have to factor in, I think, the vaccines and efficient, equitable distribution of the vaccines to help alleviate this pandemic, which may take many months. Factoring that all in, I think I'm predicting a stable economy, not a drastically different economy, higher or lower than what was projected in December. Again, the Revenue Forecasting Committee meets again in, was it February?
May.
May. Economic Forecasting Commission first, and then the Revenue Forecasting Committee. And if there are dramatic changes in their forecast, then we will certainly accommodate those.
If I may, for a couple of sentences, regroup that. I agree. I would not call this a placeholder budget. I would call it a budget that continues the priorities that the governor has set and also sets up a plan to save some funds in the case. What this pandemic has taught us is that we do not know what we don't know until we know it. And so it says this is what we know now. This is what we believe we have the capacity to do. We have the capacity to increase some rates. We have the capacity to continue to fund GPA. We have the capacity to maximize federal resources. We have the capacity to set aside a little bit of money in case we need those funds for revenue sharing. And I should restate, revenue sharing and CFC are meeting as a meeting in February, but they don't officially have report meetings until May, and that's what this budget does.
Revenue forecast.
Yes.
Thank you, Governor.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good reason. It's a good reason to stock away as much as $320 million, an unprecedented amount, but a reasonable amount in the rainy day fund. Caitlin Andrews, the BDN.
Good afternoon, Governor. Can you hear me?
We can. Good afternoon, Caitlin.
My internet is a little bad, so I apologize.
We're going to fix that.
So I guess two things. One, I kind of want to circle back to something that's been asked about earlier and basically say, can we get like a total figure of reductions either in like efficiencies and like the reserve funding, like what you mentioned from the municipal bond bank, can we get just like total figures of those? Maybe not immediately right now, but sometime later today, just to get a real straight understanding of that. And I guess a question that I want to ask is, do you see any sticking points in this budget? Do you anticipate anything where there will be continued conversation or maybe some resistance?
I'll take the first question, Governor, while you think on the second. So, Caitlin, thanks for the question. And so there's several pieces of paper that will be or actually virtual paper that will be distributed after this meeting, and they will include some highlights and some talking points, as well as a timeline of how we continue to talk about what's happened over the course of the last 10 months. In addition to that, the Bureau of Budget will be posting the documents on its website today. And I want to say that today goes through 11/59/59. That office has been extraordinarily busy and is doing everything it can to make sure that those documents are available on the same day as we talk about them. So they are working on that right now.
And a good starting point might be the curtailment order of September 17th, 2020, which contains 12 pages of minuscule font, about 270 specific measures as part of the curtailment order, much of which has been carried through to the supplemental budget and to the biennial budget. In terms of sticking points, it's not for me to say. There aren't any dramatic changes in this budget. There aren't any major programs or sticking points, as you might call them. To me, it's a non-political document. It's a no-nonsense, no-drama document, plain and simple.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brad Rogers, WGME.
Hi, Governor. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Budget. Is there any revenue sharing for cities and towns in the budget? And I have another question.
We carry through the same increase in revenue sharing that we put in the biennial budget of almost 2 years ago.
Okay, and I also saw there's
Go ahead. And let me just add, I'm trying to do a visual here for how much of the state budget is a pass-through to local and county and school governing bodies. So much of it, whether it's GPA, an increase in state share of general purpose aid to education, ultimately, is to reduce the burden of the property taxes, which helps the towns and cities. Revenue sharing exists and is at the same level as it was before in our proposal. Other funds that go to help with roads and services of all sorts help support the towns and cities. Commissioner Figueroa, did you want to add anything to that about revenue sharing?
So I just want to clarify that in FY21, the rate changed from 3 to 3.75%. And to your point, that rate continues through 22 and 23. I think
about $35 million for each point.
I think it's worth noting that that increase to 3.75 has resulted in more cash to municipalities. So over FY20, it was approximately 114 million, and through FY21, even though revenues have gone down, the projected revenue sharing will be closer to $140 million because of that increased percentage.
Okay, thanks. I have one other quick question. I saw also that general assistance has gone up a little bit to cities and towns as well. Are you concerned, I guess, about how concerned are you about cities and towns that their budgets have all had to go on up? It seems like significantly from this. Are you concerned about that, and talk about that a bit?
Well, yeah, it's a balancing act, and cities and towns have also received some relief through the state, through the CRF funds. If you look at that chart that's on the website, on the Maine State Gov budget website, you'll see the substantial amount of funds have gone to cities and towns through the federal relief funds. And some of that continues. I can't be sure what's in the new stimulus or relief package from the federal government. We just haven't done enough analysis of it yet. But I think there's some money there for cities and towns as well. We're always concerned about the impact on public safety, in particular firefighting and police departments at the local level and the state level.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. TJ Trumbull.
Good afternoon, Governor. I actually don't have a question. It was already been covered.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think Joe Lala is the last person on the list. Joe, you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks for taking our questions. A question for Commissioner Lambrou. The money for rate increases for Section 29 nursing homes, adults with ID and developmental disabilities. Can you reflect that in a percentage increase? And does that approach what these groups were asking for in terms of rate increases? And maybe if you could just kind of delineate why this was a priority for the state.
Sure. So because we are in this uncertain time, as the governor expressed, these are all rate increases that reflect state or federal requirements or policies, continuing to rebase some of our payment rates, adjusting some of our payment rates to minimum wages, and trying to ensure that we're in compliance with different federal requirements. So that is what is in the biennial budget. We also do include $25.5 million for the Medicaid Stabilization Fund. That is partly because, again, of the uncertainty. It may be that we have Medicaid main care enrollment increase and we need that money for that. It could be that the federal government comes back at us with disallowances or other requirements that cause us to spend money. Or it could be, if we do find ourselves in the stable economy that the governor talked about, that could potentially be used for a rate system evaluation that is currently underway for all main care rates that will provide information to the legislature, to the governor, on where our rates stand relative to other issues. But for now, the rate increases in the biennial budget reflect what we need to do to keep pace as good partners with the federal government as well as our state legislative directives.
Okay, so is there a ballpark percentage increase then, or not really?
No, each of them is different because of the different policies that are required. But I would note that generally we also have in main care looked for efficiencies. We have, for example, really tried to take advantage of the Medicaid expansion matching rate, which is 90%. We used to have programs that were for uninsured people. We're trying to get those people into main care to access that federal funding. That's a big advantage to the state this year. We've also looked for zeroed in on those efficiencies in our contracts. We've really been able to squeeze out millions of dollars from our contracts to be able to help, again, stabilize the budget and sustain our services that are so important to the people of Maine. And we have a lot of common sense cost savings in this budget. For example, when you have more people in main care or Medicaid, you can get bigger drug rebates from Big Pharma. So that's part of the savings as well that's in this budget. So while there is some main care increases in spending, we also have main care savings.
Okay, one last question for Governor Mills. Just real quick, I noticed it said that you were making progress towards the 40,000 minimum for teachers. Can you say like how close you're getting to that 40,000 in this budget, and why it was priority?
I think it goes to $37,000 or $38,000 a year minimum teacher wage in this budget, and the agreement with the legislature in the last budget, we had initially proposed that we go directly to $40,000 a year minimum salary. There were some negotiations, if I remember correctly, and how much would the state contribute towards that, and we will continue to contribute towards that, but it was to be phased in. So it's being phased in, but we're phasing it in as promptly as we feel appropriate, feel it's possible.
37.5, Governor.
37.5, so between 37 and 38, phew.
Good memory.
So that's where it stands now. And the state's continuing to contribute the gap, to the difference between existing and that level. Bring teachers up to par. Is that it, Joe?
That's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, all of you. I think there are no easy answers to your questions because the budget is such a combination of things that flow from one place to another, and simple things like travel, out-of-state travel for state employees, freezing many positions, many vacancies across state government that went back to last summer. No more conferences for obvious reasons. Saving money in ways small and large has allowed us to propose a very balanced budget, both for this current year and for the biennium. As I say, I think it is predominantly a no-drama, no-nonsense budget, and I hope you'll take the time to read as much as you can and ask any follow-up questions of myself and my office and Commissioner Rohr and Commissioner Lambrew. We look forward to a vigorous debate and deliberations and collaboration with the Appropriations Committee and with members of the legislature in both houses. We have briefed them, the leadership in the Appropriations Committee and the leadership of both parties in both houses this morning to a similar extent, and we'll continue to keep them posted on any changes in these proposals and listen to any changes that they propose in turn. Thank you so much for your time. Stay safe.